Tokyo is trying to downplay Trump's statement, but does it mean that Japan is next on the US president's hit list?
Japan has just made a massive move that has everyone shocked. Last week, President Trump addressed the sudden turbulence in the stock market, attempting to calm concerns after significant losses. At the heart of the volatility was growing confusion around the administration's tariff policy, particularly regarding imported electric vehicles. These tariffs, it's now becoming clear, are much broader and potentially more damaging than initially understood. The aim was to protect domestic car manufacturers from foreign competition. In practice, the tariffs targeted Japanese automakers, longtime players in the electric vehicle space and historic trade partners with the United States. Companies like Toyota, Nissan, and Honda were directly affected. These are firms that have, over the decades, helped shape the global automotive industry and have a deep footprint in the U.S. market. The backlash was immediate, but few could have predicted just how serious the consequences would become. In a move that surprised even seasoned analysts, Japan, one of America's most trusted financial allies, began selling off an enormous portion of its holdings in U.S. Treasury bonds. The figure was staggering, roughly $1.7 trillion. For years, Japan had been one of the largest foreign holders of American debt. Its consistent purchases of U.S. bonds helped to stabilize the dollar and finance U.S. government spending. The relationship, though rarely front and center in political headlines, was considered one of the cornerstones of international financial cooperation. Suddenly, that foundation was shaken. The sell-off triggered a chain reaction. Bond yields rose sharply as the market was flooded with excess supply. The dollar lost ground. Investors, both institutional and individual, started to panic. Within days, Wall Street began to slide. By the end of the week, trillions in market value had evaporated, and global markets were feeling the shockwaves. This event has raised a difficult question. Why would Japan, a longtime U.S. ally and financial partner, make such a dramatic move? The answer, according to many observers, lies in Tokyo's growing frustration with Washington's trade policies. Not just recent tariffs, but years of economic tension that had been building under the surface. For Japan, the decision to target the electric vehicle sector wasn't just about economics. It touched a nerve, one tied to national pride and long-standing industrial leadership. Japan has been a leader in electric and hybrid vehicle development for decades. The Toyota Prius changed the market for hybrid cars. The Nissan Leaf was one of the first mass-market electric vehicles in the world. These weren't just products, they were symbols of Japanese innovation and competitiveness. So when the United States moved to impose steep tariffs on these vehicles, it wasn't seen as a standard trade dispute. It felt personal. Efforts to resolve the issue behind the scenes apparently went nowhere. Multiple sources have reported that high-level negotiations stalled and that Tokyo felt boxed in. Faced with mounting pressure on one of its most important industries, Japan used one of the few tools at its disposal: its massive holdings in American government debt. Selling off treasury bonds isn't something done lightly. It's a move with serious implications, not only for financial markets, but also for the broader political relationship between nations. By choosing to do so, Japan effectively signaled that it was no longer willing to play by the same rules it believed were no longer being respected by Washington. The financial impact of the sell-off was swift. Treasury bond yields rose as prices fell, making it more expensive for the U.S. government to borrow money. This directly impacted interest rates across the economy. Mortgage rates ticked up, corporate borrowing became costlier, and consumer credit began to tighten. Investors started shifting their money, unsure of what would come next. Some hedge funds pulled out of equities, reallocating capital in search of safer assets. Others doubled down on short positions, betting that things would get worse before they got better. Ordinary investors, everyday Americans, weren't spared. Retirement accounts took a hit. Index funds and mutual funds saw declines. Many people saw their savings shrink almost overnight, unsure of what was happening or why. Global markets, which are deeply interconnected, reacted just as strongly. European and Asian exchanges followed Wall Street's lead, tumbling amid the uncertainty. Central banks in other countries watched nervously, worried that further bond sell-offs could destabilize their own currencies and economic plans. And while analysts scrambled to explain the situation, a consistent theme emerged. This was not just a market correction or a blip caused by poor communication. It was a consequence of policy decisions that underestimated the deep economic relationships the U.S. has relied on for decades. The White House initially downplayed the situation, suggesting it was a temporary fluctuation and that confidence in the U.S. economy remained strong. But as markets continued to fall and bond yields remained elevated, those reassurances began to ring hollow. Japan's actions were viewed by some as a form of economic retaliation, a way to push back without direct confrontation. Instead of responding to tariffs with counter-tariffs, Tokyo struck at the heart of the U.S. financial system. By unloading bonds, it put pressure on the dollar, increased American borrowing costs, and signaled to other countries that alternative strategies were on the table. And that's perhaps the most important point here. Japan's move was not just about its own economic self-interest. It was also a message, one that other nations were clearly paying attention to. For countries that have long relied on the US-led global financial system, the sell-off raised serious questions. Is the dollar still the safest store of value? Can US policies still be trusted? Are there other options? This shift in sentiment, while subtle, could have long-term consequences. Confidence is everything in global finance. Once it begins to erode, restoring it becomes a far greater challenge. And as we've seen before, financial systems are particularly vulnerable when politics and economics collide. As financial markets continued to react to Japan's decision to sell off $1.7 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds, the broader consequences of that move began to take shape. While the immediate impact was seen in rising bond yields and falling stock prices, what followed was something much deeper, a gradual but significant shift in global financial alliances. Japan's sell-off was not an isolated event. It was the beginning of a broader realignment in how countries viewed their economic relationships with the United States. For decades, America's position as the center of the global financial system had gone largely unchallenged. The US dollar was the reserve currency of the world. Treasury bonds were considered among the safest investments available, and American markets were the hub for global capital. But beneath that stability, resentment had been growing. Many countries, including long-standing US allies, had become increasingly frustrated with Washington's approach to international trade and finance. Tariffs, sanctions, and the unilateral use of economic pressure had caused discomfort, especially when these actions were taken without consultation or warning. Japan's move was seen by many of these nations not just as an act of self-defense, but as a signal that it was possible to push back. In the weeks following the bond sell-off, financial leaders in Tokyo began reaching out to other major economies. These talks, which took place largely behind closed doors, focused on developing new ways to reduce dependency on the US dollar and establish more regional financial cooperation. Countries such as China, South Korea, India, and even some Southeast Asian nations expressed interest in exploring alternatives. China, for example, had already been moving in this direction for years. Its efforts to internationalize the yuan and build an independent financial infrastructure had seen limited success, mainly because of global trust issues. But with Japan's involvement, the conversation changed. Japan brought not just credibility, but experience, transparency, and influence. Suddenly, the idea of a more balanced, multipolar financial system started to gain traction. India began increasing its gold reserves and adjusting its foreign asset holdings. South Korea made similar moves, scaling back its exposure to dollar-denominated assets. Even smaller economies like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia showed interest in joining regional financial mechanisms that would reduce their reliance on U.S. markets. For many of these countries, the shift wasn't only about economics, it was about sovereignty. There was a growing sense that being too dependent on the American financial system left them vulnerable to political decisions made in Washington, decisions that might not align with their national interests. As Japan's strategy unfolded, financial analysts around the world began to take notice. The coordinated nature of these changes suggested more than just caution. It pointed to a calculated effort to build an alternative. Countries were entering into new agreements to facilitate trade in local currencies, bypassing the need to convert everything into dollars. Currency swap agreements between central banks became more common, and regional development banks saw a surge in capital. This was not just a financial trend, it was a structural shift. Japan increased its investments in Asian infrastructure, directed funds into development projects across Southeast Asia, and expanded its bond holdings in regional economies. The move away from U.S. assets wasn't just reactive, it was strategic. It reflected a desire to invest in the region's future, rather than in a system increasingly seen as unpredictable. One major element of this realignment was the silent backing of China. While the two nations have their own complex history, both understood that a more resilient Asian financial framework would serve their long-term interests. For China, Japan's involvement helped to legitimize efforts that had previously been viewed with suspicion. For Japan, cooperation offered a way to increase its influence and diversify its financial partnerships without relying too heavily on any single nation. The quiet summits and policy drafts between Japan, China, South Korea, and other regional players were not immediately reported in Western media. The focus remained on short-term market fluctuations and ongoing trade disputes. But behind the scenes, a much more significant development was taking place, one that could ultimately reshape global finance. Even beyond Asia, the ripple effects were being felt. In Europe, leaders were already grappling with escalating trade tensions with the United States. Washington's decisions to impose tariffs on European goods had sparked frustration in Brussels, Paris, and Berlin. The European Union had been exploring the idea of a digital euro and other mechanisms to reduce dependence on the dollar. Japan's move gave new urgency to those efforts. Russia, which had been steadily reducing its exposure to U.S. assets since the imposition of sanctions several years earlier, saw the developments as validation of its long-term strategy. Moscow had already diversified its reserves, increased gold holdings, and strengthened economic ties with Asia and the Middle East. Latin American and Middle Eastern nations, while not as vocal, began revisiting their own financial strategies. Discussions around regional cooperation and trade in local currencies gained momentum. Oil exporters, particularly those in the Gulf, started exploring non-dollar payment systems for energy contracts. These were subtle changes, but collectively, they pointed to a broader shift in sentiment. What made this moment different from past market disruptions was the level of coordination and the seriousness of the actors involved. Japan, after all, is not a fringe economy. It is the third largest economy in the world, and its financial institutions are deeply embedded in global systems. Its decision to pivot signaled that the old assumptions about financial loyalty could no longer be taken for granted. American policymakers were slow to react. In Washington, many believed that the dollar's dominance was too entrenched to be threatened. They pointed to the size of U.S. capital markets, the liquidity of treasury bonds, and the lack of viable alternatives. And to some extent, they were right. There is no immediate replacement for the dollar as a global reserve currency. But the real danger wasn't a sudden collapse, it was the gradual erosion of trust. The belief that allies would continue to support the U.S. system, no matter how they were treated, proved to be short-sighted. Japan's actions showed that even the most stable relationships have limits. And once those limits are crossed, the consequences can be long-lasting. Over the next several months, financial institutions around the world began adjusting their models. Risk assessments changed. Portfolio managers reevaluated their exposure to U.S. debt. Currency analysts started factoring in geopolitical risk at levels not seen in years. This wasn't panic, it was preparation. At first, the changes were subtle. Interest rates began to rise as bond yields climbed. For the average American family, this translated into higher mortgage costs and steeper credit card bills. Home buyers who had been saving for months suddenly found themselves priced out of the market. Those with adjustable-rate mortgages saw their monthly payments shoot up, putting pressure on already tight household budgets. Inflation, which had been rising gradually, began to accelerate. The weakening of the dollar made imported goods more expensive. Everyday items, groceries, fuel, consumer electronics, all started to cost more. For families on fixed incomes, the change was immediate and painful. Suddenly, paychecks didn't stretch as far. Even basic necessities became harder to afford. The cost of new vehicles, particularly electric ones, surged. Tariffs on imported cars, especially from Japan, pushed prices higher than ever. What was once an emerging and affordable option for environmentally conscious drivers became out of reach for many middle-class buyers. American automakers, too, began to feel the pressure as supply chains tightened and consumer demand shifted. At the same time, the stock market downturn that had begun with Japan's bond sell-off continued to deepen. What began as a correction quickly turned into a broader sell-off. Institutional investors were the first to pull out, followed by hedge funds and eventually retail investors. By the time the dust settled, over $5 trillion in market value had been erased. Pension funds took a major hit, particularly those relying heavily on equities. For millions of Americans, retirement plans were suddenly in jeopardy. This economic pain was not limited to Wall Street. It spread quickly to Main Street. As borrowing costs rose and market uncertainty increased, businesses began to cut costs. Layoffs were announced. Hiring slowed. Manufacturing hubs in the Midwest and South saw factories scale back production or shut down entirely. For workers in these communities, many of whom had supported the administration's trade agenda, the situation felt like a betrayal. The policies that had been promised as protectionist and meant to bring jobs back home and reduce reliance on foreign goods were now contributing to economic instability. And while leaders in Washington insisted that these were short-term setbacks, many Americans weren't convinced. Labor unrest started to spread. It began with a few high-profile strikes in the auto industry. Workers walked off the job demanding better wages, more job security, and relief from the rising cost of living. Steel workers soon followed. Teachers, truck drivers, and retail employees began organizing in larger numbers. Within weeks, more than 5 million Americans were on strike, the largest labor movement in generations. The message from the workers was clear. They felt they had been used, promised economic revival, but instead left to bear the brunt of a policy misfire. Unions and labor leaders placed the blame squarely on the administration, accusing it of launching a trade war without understanding or addressing its domestic impact. As the strikes intensified, support for the administration began to falter among key political allies. Wall Street, which had largely backed Trump throughout his presidency, began to lose patience. For years, financial institutions had looked the other way on rhetoric and policy unpredictability because the markets were performing well. But now, with the economy faltering and global capital shifting elsewhere, those same allies started to distance themselves. Campaign contributions from major banks and hedge funds slowed. Some firms began moving assets offshore. Executives who had once attended White House events now publicly questioned whether the leadership was sustainable. Financial media, typically cautious in its criticism, started openly discussing the risks of continuing on the current path. This change wasn't loud or dramatic. It happened in back channels, in closed-door meetings, in quiet shifts of capital. But the message was unmistakable. The financial elite were preparing for a post-Trump landscape. As pressure mounted both at home and abroad, the biggest shift of all was unfolding quietly in international circles. Japan, China, and Russia, three economic powers with very different political systems and histories, announced a plan to create a new international financial framework. The core idea was a global reserve system that didn't rely on the US dollar. Instead, it would be based on a currency basket that included the Chinese yuan, Japanese yen, Russian ruble, and other regional currencies. For decades, the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency had given the US a unique advantage. It allowed for low borrowing costs, gave American companies a competitive edge, and gave Washington extraordinary power to impose sanctions or dictate global trade terms. But this new system threatened to change all of that. With Japan on board, the plan had immediate credibility. Other nations began to take it seriously. India started to reduce its dollar reserves. Brazil signaled interest in trade agreements based on the new currency basket. Even some European countries, frustrated by trade disputes and dollar volatility, began exploring alternatives. Oil producers in the Middle East, long reliant on the petrodollar system, began discussing pricing energy contracts in alternative currencies. The shift wasn't immediate, but the intent was clear. Nations around the world were quietly moving away from the dollar, not with hostility, but with caution and pragmatism. This wasn't a collapse, it was a transition. The American government responded with reassurances. Officials maintained that the dollar was still the most stable and liquid currency in the world. And for now, It remains the dominant force in global finance. But confidence is a fragile thing. Once countries believe they have other viable options, the shift can accelerate faster than anyone expects. At the heart of all this was a loss of trust. Longtime allies no longer felt confident in Washington's leadership. They no longer believed that the rules of the old financial system were being followed. And most importantly, they no longer believed that their economic futures were best tied to the dollar. At home, the toll of this shift was becoming clear. Inflation remained stubbornly high. Interest rates were still elevated. Jobs were harder to find. And for many Americans, the idea of economic stability, let alone prosperity, felt more distant than ever. Political leaders tried to contain the damage, but the divisions ran deep. The trade war that was meant to strengthen American industry had instead weakened its economy. The tariffs that were supposed to level the playing field had isolated the country from its partners. And the financial strategy that relied on the enduring loyalty of allies had underestimated just how much goodwill had been spent. Now, as global economic leadership begins to shift, the United States faces a difficult question. Can it regain the trust of its partners and the confidence of its own people? Or has the world moved on, quietly but decisively, into a new era where American dominance is no longer the starting point, but just one option among many?